Hey, I'm glad you're back with us as we continue through the Gospel of Mark. So, in our last study, we talked about the passage from Mark 15:34. I'll just go ahead and read that to get that back in our mind. It was Elio, Elio, lama sabachthani, which is translated, my God, why have you forsaken me? So, last time we investigated the hints that Mark had kind of sprinkled through this text in Mark 15 and discovered the clues that he had given us that referenced us back to Psalm 22. Those three clues, some of them, there were probably more. I picked up on three that I pulled out and talked about. But the first one was they divided his garments, casting lots for them. This was a detail that Mark was giving us in his gospel account. The second one was wagging their heads. It's just an interesting phrase to use, and for that phrase to be used there and then also back in Psalm 22 was no coincidence. Mark was specifically trying to draw our minds back to that. The third point, obviously, is this reference, this direct quote from Psalm 22, my God, why have you forsaken me? And we talked about how a lot of times, I think the typical understanding of this passage is that somehow or another, God the Father, at that moment when Christ was on the cross, somehow turned his back on Jesus. And so we talked about how if you read through the text of Psalm 22, how that really wasn't what the psalmist was communicating. And likely that wasn't what Jesus was communicating. And in fact, it was to the contrary, because we see that God was there sustaining and supporting the one that had this feeling of being forsaken, as the text goes on in Psalm 22. So if you haven't read that in a couple of days, go back and read Psalm 22 to freshen up on the thoughts on that, and read all the way through the end, because it gives hope. It gives a sense of God is there, for God is not forsaken the afflicted one, is what it says there. So we went through all that exercise, and it might have been a little bit different way of looking at that passage than you have looked before. So I wanted to give some time to think about that and let that settle in and digest. And today I wanted to go in and talk a little bit about some principles that I think are important in understanding it in light of Psalm 22 and why I think that's important. So the first reason is, I think somehow or another we have this idea that God is allergic to sin. Now, don't get me wrong, God detests sin, but it's not like he can't be in the presence of sin. He can't catch the disease of sin. He is holy. There's some examples of Jesus or of God being around sin. So this idea that he's allergic to it is just, I can't find any place that says that he is allergic, or he can't be in the present, that he has to be in some sort of a bubble and immune from or away from sin, separated from sin. Here's a couple examples, one from the Old Testament, one from the New Testament, just to make the point. Job 2:1 is an example of that. It says, again, there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came among them to present himself before the Lord. So here in Job, you have a picture of the throne room of God, and Satan is coming, who is evil, obviously, is coming before the Lord. So this idea that God can't be around sin just doesn't line up with that passage from Job and others in Job as well. Another passage from the New Testament says, but God demonstrated his own love towards us in that while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. So how did he demonstrate his love, and when? When we were sinners, he still loved us. So this idea that he can't be around it, I just don't think doesn't seem to line up with Scripture the way I understand it. The second big idea that I think is important in this understanding of Psalm 22 is the nature of the Godhead, the eternal triune God, Father, Son, Holy Spirit. The Father existed from eternity back to eternity forward. The Holy Spirit existed eternity back, eternity forward. The Son existed eternity back in eternity forward. And all three exist right now as well. All three are in communion with each other, eternity to eternity, right? And right now. So with that very important, crucial teaching of the historic Christian faith and the understanding of the nature of the Godhead, to have this idea that at some point that the Godhead was somehow separated by God turning his back, I think is problematic. Because by definition of the Godhead, it is unchanging. He is unchanging, right? So that's another important thing in this understanding of this passage. The third big takeaway in this, and there's a 3A and a 3B on this one, but Christ understands and persevered through this. And by his example and by his power, we can too. You see, because Jesus felt this sense of abandonment. And so the B part of this point is that while Jesus was feeling that sense of abandonment, if God the Father had turned his back on Christ during that most desperate point in his life, what kind of precedence does that set up for us when we're in our points of desperation and our points of need? Does God just turn his back on us? No, I think Psalm 22 points to the contrary on that. And we can, by Christ's example, persevere through these times of despair, just like he did, because God was with him in the midst of the trial and the pain. There's comfort in that for you and me. We find that in Psalm 22. Fourth, sound biblical interpretation tools are not hard. We've seen this worked out, and so I oftentimes say I love teaching the Bible, but something I love to do even more, and one of the reasons why I approach Bible study the way I do is I want to teach how to study the Bible. And so that's why in passages like this in Psalm 22, I'm a new NAS translation guy, so that's what I use all the time when doing real deep Bible study. But NAS uses all caps. You see that here in the text on the screen. My God, why have you forsaken me? It uses all caps when referring back to the Old Testament. Your Bible may have little cross references like mine does down the center column. And that's giving you Old Testament reference oftentimes to what's going on in the text. So you can be this student. It doesn't take some advanced theological degree to be able to do this. Just simple $50 Bible can help give you the tools to be able to go back. You go back, you find the Old Testament reference, and you read a chapter before and a chapter behind. So I just want to encourage you to be students of the Bible, and the scriptures come alive so much more in depth and vivid when we take the time and we assert the discipline to go back and investigate and discover these Old Testament references like we've done through the Psalm 22 passage. So this is just an example of a good Bible study principle that we've been studying through here. All right, so let's get on to some new stuff for today. I'm going to read verse 34 again because it kind of ramps us into verse 35. At the 9th hour, Jesus cried out with a loud voice, Elio, Elio, lama sabachthani, which translated, my God, why have you forsaken me? When some of the bystanders heard it, they began saying, behold, he is calling for Elijah. So why would they think that he's calling for Elijah? And if we think phonetically and think practically through this, the Psalms passage tells us that Jesus's mouth is dry. And think about from a practical standpoint of the physiological stuff that's going on as someone is crucified. They are slouching down, because a lot of people think that people bled to death when crucified, but in fact what happened was you suffocated to death, because your diaphragm, when you're slouched over hours of having your being hanged on the cross, your diaphragm would contract and you would be unable to expand and contract your lungs there, and so we see that going on. And so Jesus likely didn't have much breath at this point, and with the other physiological things that are going on, if you said Elio and Elijah, it's that Eli, that the first couple of phrases there might have sounded a lot like Elijah. So there's the practical standpoint of it. The theological, eschatological, end times is what eschatological means, study of end times. Why would we be thinking Elijah there? Why would they be thinking Elijah? Well, Malachi 4:5-6 says, "Behold, I am going to send to you Elijah, the prophet, before the coming of the great and terrible day of the Lord. He will restore the hearts of the fathers to their children, and the hearts of the children to their fathers, so that I will not come and smite the land with a curse." So Elijah is God's agent of eschatology. And the audience that would have been surrounding Jesus at this point would be thinking, oh, he's looking for a last-ditch effort. He's calling on Elijah for God to bring Elijah to end all of this before he dies. So that very likely was what was going on in their minds. But when we think about that through the narrative of Mark, that's kind of a foolish idea that they had. This again is a hint to how clueless they were to the identity of Jesus, because throughout Mark's account of the gospel, Jesus has consistently been teaching that Elijah has already come. If that was a consistent point in his teaching, starting off in Mark chapter 1, where he points to John the Baptist being the way preparer. And then we also think about the transfiguration, where Elijah has already come to the scene. So why would they now believe that Jesus is calling for Elijah? It's just interesting to think about through that as we pick through that verse there. So moving on, in verse 36-38, it says, "Someone ran and filled a sponge with sour wine, put it on a reed, and gave it to him to drink, saying, 'Let us see whether Elijah will come to take him down.'" You almost get the idea of a jeer or a taunt in the midst of that statement, don't you? Verse 37, it says, "And Jesus uttered a loud cry and breathed his last. And the veil of the temple was torn in two from top to the bottom." So this is the second miraculous event that points to Jesus' identity in Mark's account of the gospel, of the crucifixion of Jesus here. Matthew gives us a little more detail. He talks about another miraculous thing of people breaking out of their graves. But we see this one as the second one in the gospel of Mark. But the first one was that idea of everything growing dark in Mark 15:33, and we talked about that last time. That's significant because it uses that apocalyptic, cataclysmic type language that's consistently used in the Bible for kingdom and regime change, like when we see the pronouncement of judgment on the temple in Israel when we studied through Mark, and then in Isaiah 13:9-10, where Isaiah is talking about Babylon, he says, "Behold, the day of the Lord is coming, cruel with fury and burning anger, to make the land a desolation. And he will exterminate the sinners from it. For the stars of the heaven and their constellations will not flash forth their light. The sun will be dark when it rises, and the moon will not shed its light." So we see there Isaiah using that same apocalyptic type language, cataclysmic type language of darkness growing to talk about this regime change. We see another example of that in Ezekiel. It says, "Son of man, take up the lamentation over Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and say to him, you have compared yourself to a young lion of the nations. Yet you are like a monster in the seas, and you burst forth in your rivers and muddied the waters with your feet and fouled the rivers." So there it talks about pronouncement of judgment over Egypt. And down in verse 7, it says, "And when I extinguish you, I will cover the heavens and darken their stars. I will cover the stars with a cloud, and the moon will not give its light." So again, Ezekiel, Isaiah, and Mark are all using this cataclysmic, apocalyptic type language to point to pronouncement of judgment and a regime change, a kingdom shift. And so here we see, as Christ is carrying out the institution of his kingdom, that as he breathes his last, that this kingdom is being shifted to his kingdom. So let's talk a little bit about the veil being ripped and the pronouncement of judgment that represented. So that extraordinary event, this miraculous sign, we've seen from Matthew, the coming forth of dead from graves. We see the cloud of darkness that Mark communicates, and now we see this temple veil being rent. So it begs the question, first of all, what veil was being rent in two? There were actually two veils in the temple area here. The first one was between the court of the Jews and the court of the Gentiles. And so we see the significance, if that was the temple veil that was being torn in two from the top to the bottom, we see the significance of that is that now the kingdom is open to Jews and Gentiles alike, right? So that would have been fairly significant. And that's a possibility that was the veil that it was talking about. But I think most scholars, and probably the way you've heard this in the past, if you studied through the Gospels before, when you study this, that most people think that it was the veil between the holy place in the temple and the most holy place. So in the holy place, the priests would have come in and done their normal duties on a fairly regular basis. Things like laying out new bread on the table of showbread, burning incense in that area, lighting candles. They would have done that semi-frequently, okay, fairly frequently. But in the most holy place, only the high priest was able to go in, and that was once a year. So if that was the temple veil, or if that was the veil that was being rent, and I think it probably was, that signifies that the presence of God was now open to all. Because see, what was supposed to be in the most holy, the holy place, the holy of holies or most holy place, was the Ark of the Covenant. And if you remember from studies of Old Testament, the Ark of the Covenant would have had the mercy seat, and then it would have had two cherubs kind of facing each other, and it was there that the presence of God was between those two cherub wings. And so the priest was to come in and sprinkle blood of the sacrifice once a year on the mercy seat there. And so it's an interesting thing to see from an extra biblical source that Josephus records that when the Roman general Pompey in 1st century BC, so this is before the ministry of Jesus, before Jesus was born, that this Roman general Pompey comes in to Judea in effort to calm the chaos prior to the first triumvirate. And so Josephus records here that Pompey goes into the Holy of Holies in Jerusalem, and Josephus records that Pompey finds nothing there. So no Ark of the Covenant. And the Ark of the Covenant represents God's presence with his people. Also, let's think back to other things that were going on in the Old Testament. You remember there was a point where the Ark had been taken away from a foreign army, and they got it back, and then they were taking it back to Israel. And so the way that they were supposed to carry it, they were supposed to have these long rods on either side of the ark, and on there would be these rings on either side of it, and they would run the long poles through the rings, and the guys would carry it on their shoulders. So that was the way that God instructed the Ark of the Covenant to be carried. Well, this time they had apparently forgotten, or were just being negligent of the fact that that was the way they were supposed to do it, and they carried it on a cart. And so an innocent and probably well-intended guy reaches out his hand at a moment where on the cart the Ark of the Covenant apparently started to slide off. So he reaches up to steady the ark, and God strikes the guy dead. So it's interesting to think of that story in light of what Josephus is recording here with Pompey coming in, because if he had come in there, something might not have ended very well for him if the Ark of the Covenant had been there in the Holy of Holies. You remember when that high priest went in once a year, they would tie a rope around the priest's legs so that if something happened, he had a heart attack or something, they could drag him out, because they didn't want to go in there when it wasn't their role or their responsibility to do that, because they feared being in that Holy of Holies place with the presence of the Ark of the Covenant, which represented God's presence. So think about that in light of what Josephus is telling us there, that Pompey comes in, he finds nothing. Now, what is suggested is that the Ark of the Covenant never made it back from exile, and that God's presence with the rebellious people during the time between the Old Testament and the New Testament, the intertestamental period, was not as acute as what they had perpetuated, and that when that veil was torn in two, it reveals the sham that they had been perpetuating. God's presence was not in the Holy of Holies. Why? Because God's presence was hanging on a tree at that moment, being crucified and shamed on the cross, bearing our sin. That's where the presence of God was, not in over some box. Mark goes on in verse 39. When the centurion who was standing right there in front of him saw that they breathed his last, he said, "Truly, this man was the Son of God." So at this point in the story, it appears as though all have abandoned Jesus. The disciples are gone. The crowds have turned. The Jewish elite were never with him in the first place. The insurrectionists on either side of him, on the cross beside him, were hurling insults at him too. The one person that stands up for Jesus is this Roman centurion. And that's an irony of ironies in the midst of all this. Because what this Greek or this Roman centurion soldier says is, truly this man, there's emphasis in the Greek on the syntax of this man, was the Son of God. So Greek is in the Greek, this is emphasized, and it's interesting that we see that Son of God language from a Roman perspective. Remember when we studied about when the Jewish establishment was trying to trap Jesus, and they had a sequential efforts to trick Jesus or trap him, and one of them was led by the Herodians, and they bring forth the charge of, do we pay taxes to Caesar? And so Jesus answers that by saying, give me a coin. Whose inscription is on this, right? And we, in our study here in Mark, we looked at one of those coins, and on the coins that would have been around at the day had an inscription on it of the Roman emperor that said, Son of God. Okay, so think about what is going on here with this Roman centurion, an agent of Rome. He's saying, this is the Son of God. Not the guy on the coin that's saying he's the Son of God. Not the guy back in Rome that's sitting up on a throne all high and mighty and lifted up, but this is the Son of God. Remember, this guy, this Roman centurion, he's sitting around, he's seeing this extraordinary activity going on when the clouds grow dark and the earth quakes and dead bodies are coming forth out of the tomb. So it's interesting to understand that. We remember from our Shakespeare back in high school that one of the reasons why Julius Caesar was killed by Brutus, when we look historically at it and look outside of what Shakespeare told us about it, but when we look at history, one of the reasons why Julius Caesar was killed was because he allowed people to revere him up to the level of the gods while he was living. You see, they weren't to be revered until they were dead. So his son, Octavian, was smart after seeing Julius Caesar killed because he elevated himself to the position of a god while he was living. His son, Octavian, played humble. And he said, don't call me a god. You can call me a son of God, but not God. And so when you put that in light and you hear that phrase coming out of a Roman centurion, it adds more weight to the statement of what he's saying there. The third element that we can look at there is when this Roman soldier is saying that this man is the emperor, not that. It's this man that's the son, the one that's hanging on the cross, not the one back in Rome. So the centurion is saying something that you would expect Jesus' disciples to say, and we wouldn't expect a disciple of the emperor to say that. Another element that's interesting to look at on this is now that we've studied through the majority of Mark, we got one more lesson next time. But remember back from Mark 1:1, how does Mark get his gospel account going? He says, the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God, Mark 1:1. So he makes this statement, Jesus Christ, the Son of God. So now that we've studied through that in light of our coin study and in light of what this Roman centurion is saying now, think about how inflammatory the beginning of the Gospel of Mark is. Because remember, who is Mark written to primarily or initially? It was written to the church in Rome. They're the initial audience for the Gospel of Mark. So this is a politically explosive claim that Mark is saying. And now that we're here at the end, I think he's kind of bookending that thought by noting what this centurion soldier was saying. This kingdom, this Son of God, this kingdom is being established by the cross. And that's the message that Mark is trying to communicate, I think, by noting this language here at the end. This is how our kingdom advances. This is how we win. Revelation 12:11 says, and they overcame him, I'm talking about the enemy, because of the blood of the Lamb and because of the word of their testimony. So how did they overcome? How does the kingdom advance? It's because of the sacrifice of Christ on the cross, the blood of the Lamb. Revelation 12:11 goes on, because the blood of the Lamb and because of the word of their testimony, and they did not love their life even when faced with death. So that's the ethic of the cross we see being portrayed and lived out by Christ. That's how the kingdom was advanced here on the cross. It's also how the kingdom advances today, because the kingdom advances through our sacrifice, through our giving up of ourselves, our self-denial for the advancement of the kingdom. It's the same cross ethic being lived out today. Psalm 22, 29 through 31 comes back into light here as we see this emblem of Rome in this centurion, this emblem of the most prosperous nation on the world being represented by this Roman centurion. So remember what the end of Psalm 22 said. This is 29 through 31. All the prosperous of the earth will eat and worship. All those who go down to the dust will bow before him. Even he who cannot keep his soul alive, prosperity will serve him. It will be told of the Lord to the coming generation. They will come and will declare his righteousness to a people who will be born that he has performed it. So one of the symbols of the power broker of the world stands here and worships and closes out this thought, I think, on the reference to Psalm 22. The text goes on, verse 40. There were also some women looking from a distance, among whom were Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of James the Less, and Joseph, and Salome. So there's a couple of things going on here. First of all, put your honor shame culture hat back on here as we look at this passage, and think about who were the high and elevated and who were low caste in the pecking order of this honor shame culture. Women were lower in the pecking order. And so think about it. If you're leading an insurrection, which a lot of people thought Jesus was doing, right? And you're here at the end, and all that's left of your group of insurrectionists are a band of women. So we see there's negatives in that. And the other thing in that, the negative in that, is that they weren't even getting close to him. Even these women weren't even getting close. The only positive that we see in that is that Jesus was not entirely alone. The Roman soldier was with him, and now we see these women standing at a distance. So let's look at who these women were. Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of James and the Less, and Joseph and Salome. So in Mark's gospel, we don't know much about these. Woman number one, Mary Magdalene, kind of over the next series of verses, she becomes a more prominent figure. But this, in Mark, this is the first time she's mentioned. Luke talks about her in 8:2. Mary Magdalene was healed of a demon. So this is the character, if you were listening back in, I don't know if it was during the 90s or early 2000s, but Dan Brown wrote this book, this fictional book called The Da Vinci Code. And in the fictional book, he starts out saying fact. And in that, he perpetuates all these lies and speculation and theory about Mary Magdalene having some sort of relationship with Jesus. But it's just not good historical research and work. In fact, it's just fabrication of facts is all that people like this do. They come up with, because history just doesn't tell us much about Mary Magdalene. We see that reference from Luke 2 from the biblical accounts, but we really don't get much outside of that. Some scholars speculate that John 7:53, 8 through 11, where it talks about the prostitute at the feet of Jesus, that might have been Mary Magdalene, but there's no, that's just speculation and theory. So we just, the long and the short on this slide is we just don't know that much about Mary Magdalene, even though people like to draw out a lot of fabricated stories that disparage Christ and his character. The second woman that we see here is Mary, the mother of James the Less. So by specifically naming this person, we can assume that Mark's audience would have known to whom Mark referred. Many conjecture that this James is also known as James, the son of Alphaeus, from Matthew 10:3. So that's about all we know on this character here. Salome, again, is mentioned in another gospel, Matthew 27:56. It says, among them was Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of James and Joseph, and the mother of the sons of Zebedee. So putting Mark and Matthew's accounts together on this, we can deduce that Salome is the mother of the sons of Zebedee. There's a parallel account to this, and I'm going to read it over in Matthew 20 through 28. It says, then the mother of the sons of Zebedee came to Jesus. This actually isn't a parallel account. This is this is a parallel account to Mark chapter 10. Sorry, I misread my notes there. But the parallel account to what happened in Mark chapter 10, it reads like this. Then the mother of the sons of Zebedee came to Jesus with her sons, bowing down and making a request of him. And he said to her, what do you wish? She said to him, command that your kingdom, these two sons of mine, will sit one on your right hand and one on your left. But Jesus answered, you do not know what you're asking. Are you able to drink of the cup that I'm about to drink? And so when we study that in Mark chapter 10, we talked about how when Jesus was talking about this cup, both here in this narrative, in this discussion where the mom comes up asking for the good seats for his kids, that he, and both at this point and at Gethsemane where he says, let this cup pass from me, that what he's talking about is all the pain, all the suffering, all the mockery, all the false trials, all the crucifixion, all of that, the weight of the world, the weight of the sin of the world crashing in on him, all of that is the cup. And so that's what he's talking about here as she makes this request. And Jesus responds with that, my cup you shall drink, but to sit on my right and my left, this is not mine to give, but it is for those whom has been prepared by my Father. And hearing this, the 10 became indignant with the two brothers. Why did they become indignant? Because they wanted the good seats, right? But Jesus called to them to himself and said, you know that the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and the great men exercise authority over them. It is not this way among you, but whoever wishes to become great among you shall be your servant, and whoever wishes to be first among you shall be your slave, just as the Son of Man, again, is referencing back to Daniel chapter 7, where Daniel points to this Son of Man receiving this dominion that's an everlasting dominion and a kingdom that's an everlasting kingdom. So when Jesus refers to himself as the Son of Man, he's referring to the kingdom being established here. Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. So how is the kingdom being established? It's through service. It's through the cross. Again, we see that cross ethic that we are to live by today still being communicated by Jesus in the gospel stories. So let's put ourselves in the position of this mom that's sitting here as she's standing there looking to the left and to the right of Jesus in light of this request that she had made just a few days prior to this. Do you suppose that all of that is crashing back down on her? And do you suppose that she might be saying, if he had granted my request, my sons would be there? I suspect that she's grief-stricken and distraught with the ifs at this point. So in a moment, Salome is gone and there's only two left. And perhaps it's because she's overwhelmed with the ifs of the moment. So put all that emotion aside, the significance of their names being mentioned, the church in Rome most likely would have known who they were. Similar to what had happened earlier in Mark's account as he's writing to this Roman church when he refers back to Alexander and Rufus and when Simon carried the cross. So, because we know from Paul's letter to Rome, to the Romans, that he references Rufus there. So they likely would have known who Jesus was, or who Mark was referring to here. Verse 41, it says, when he was in Galilee, they used to follow him and minister to him, and there were many other women who came up with him to Jerusalem. So it's just interesting to note here that there were many women who were followers of Jesus as well, not just men. Verse 42 through 43, when evening had already come, because it was the preparation day, that is the day before the Sabbath, Joseph of Arimathea came, a prominent member of the council, who himself was waiting for the kingdom of God. And he gathered up courage, and he went before Pilate and asked for the body of Jesus. So we'll pick through these verses a little bit. First of all, let's talk about this idea of a day in the Jewish mind. We think of a day starting in the morning, but that's not the way the Jewish mind thought. They thought of days starting in the evening. So Friday actually would have started on our Thursday evening at 6 p.m. and would have carried through our Friday at 6 p.m. and that's when the day would have ended, at Friday at 6 p.m. So Jesus was on the cross on preparation day, sometime between afternoon to evening on Friday, and then he's in the tomb all day on our Saturday, the Jewish Sabbath. And then sometime, very likely early morning on our Sunday morning, Jesus would have resurrected. So that's the way their minds were a little bit different. And I just wanted to note that to you, because there's some that say, well, Jesus wasn't really in the tomb for 3 days. See, he died on Friday afternoon and he rose on Sunday. So that really wasn't 3 days. But that's a Westerner's way of thinking of time, not a Jewish person's way of thinking of time, because they would have thought in this structure here. So he would have been in on Friday, and any portion of the day would have been considered a day. So he would have been part of the day on Friday, all day on Saturday, and part of the day on Sunday, 3 days. So let's look a little bit more on about this guy that comes onto the scene. The gospel accounts give us more information. Mark tells us that he was a prominent member of the council, but what council? Well, this would have been the Sanhedrin Council, which would have been the elite of the elite. They were the reason why Jesus was crucified. They were the ones that turned Jesus over to the Romans. Matthew gives us a little bit more information about Joseph of Arimathea. When it was evening, there came a rich man from Arimathea named Joseph, who himself had also become a disciple of Jesus. So we see that he was a rich man. We see that he had become a disciple of Jesus. Luke 23:50 through 51 says, and a man named Joseph, who was a member of the council, a good and righteous man. So he was rich, he was a member of the council, he was a disciple of Jesus, he was good and he was righteous. He had not consented to the plan and action of the council. A man from Arimathea, a city of the Jews, who was waiting for the kingdom of God. So another thing that we learn is that he was waiting the kingdom of God. John 19:38 says, after these things, Joseph of Arimathea, being a disciple of Jesus, but a secret one for fear of the Jews. So John gives us that extra little tidbit of information that he was a secret disciple of Jesus. And I don't want to pick too hard on Joseph here at this point, because I think he's early in his spiritual walk of maturity, but he's about to grow up a lot in these next couple of verses that we're about to look at. He had been secretive in his relationship and his devotion to Christ. And so, but think through what we're about to go through here in these next couple of slides. And I want you to consider, as a devotional thought, as a application thought from this text, can you be a secret, mature disciple of Jesus? I'm going to present my opinion on that, and I'm going to say no. You know, I think our lives should be distinctive. Our people should know. We should live out our faith. We should be different from the world. And when given the opportunity to teach people about it, we are no longer secretive. We have to come out, and it may cost. We're going to see as we go through the next couple of slides what this costs Joseph. So, what's significant about Joseph of Arimathea going public before Pilate with his devotion to Jesus? So, put our honor shame culture hat back on as we process through what's happening here. You see, in this honor shame culture, burial in a shameful way has ramifications on the one being buried, but it also has ramifications on those who are associated with the one being buried. So by bringing an honorable burial to the one the Jewish elite, this Sanhedrin Council, had just condemned, it doesn't look good on your resume. So Joseph is taking a huge risk. He's giving it up, his affluence and his influence here. Joseph, unlike the other disciples of Jesus, unlike the women who were at a distance, was okay now with a public display of his devotion to Jesus. Let's think back to Mark chapter 10 and his interaction with the rich young ruler, and Matthew 27, where it talks about this interaction with the rich man from Arimathea. This interaction, remember in that interaction with the rich man, in Mark's gospel account, the guy went away grieving because Jesus challenged him to give up his possessions and sell it to the poor. Even though he had been living a good religious life, Jesus challenges him to let loose of the things that he was holding greater than Jesus. And now we have this rich man from Arimathea showing how with God all things are possible. It's impossible for a rich man to inherit the kingdom, is what we learned from Mark chapter 10. But here we see how that works out, because Jesus says, but with God all things are possible. And so how is that possible? Through the power and trust in Jesus that Joseph of Arimathea is having. He's giving up all. He's risking, and he's, through his public demonstration of devotion, he's potentially risked and denied his influence with the Sanhedrin Council and his affluence, his wealth. So Mark goes on in 43, it says that he gathered up his courage. Don't miss the weight of that. In light of this honor-shame culture, that he gathered up his courage and he went before Pilate. And we have those moments too, where we have to muster up the courage and do what Jesus has called us to do, even though it may cause us risk of losing popularity or risk of losing a job potentially. That's what Joseph of Arimathea is demonstrating how the kingdom operates today. Again, another example of the ethic of the cross, and Joseph this time is showing that. Christ's kingdom was being established in this act of self-denial. This self-sacrifice of Joseph of Arimathea is demonstrating how Christ's kingdom is initiated and still operates today through us, his church. Verse 44 said, Pilate wondered if he was dead by this time, and summoning the centurion, he questioned him as to whether he was already dead. So crucifixion sometimes took a long time, a couple of days in some instances. And so Pilate may have been skeptical at the quick death of Jesus here. But remember, he was tortured pretty severely by both the Jewish leaders and the Roman leaders. In fact, I think at one point Pilate was probably just trying to beat him severely to hope that he wouldn't have to turn him over to be crucified. So he was beaten pretty badly. One shy of the death penalty, basically, was what the beating that he received by the Romans. So what some people think, and this whole segment right here goes against what's called the swoon theory. The swoon theory that many detractors of the gospel of Jesus say is that Jesus never really died, that he just swooned, that he passed out from all the pain that he had been going through, but he didn't really die, and they placed him in the tomb, and the coolness of the tomb woke him back up, essentially. So perhaps Pilate was thinking that this idea that's still being perpetuated even today might have been in its infancy of taking place. Well, by Pilate doing what he is about to do, it debunks this whole theory. This is a bunch of rubbish, this swoon theory. So what Pilate does is he gets a trained killing machine, a Roman centurion, who would not make the mistake when it comes to death. Why would a Roman centurion not make a mistake? Because the penalty on a Roman centurion, if they didn't carry out the orders that they would have been carried out, is they would have received that punishment. So if they were ordered to beat someone 10 lashes and they didn't do it, they would receive 10 lashes. If they were ordered to execute a death and they didn't do it, then they would have been executed. So by going to this Roman centurion, he's validating the reality of the death of Jesus. So don't miss that. That's a huge gospel principle. Christ, in his physical body, was dead, buried, and physical body was resurrected. Important, critical points of gospel teaching. 45 through 47 says, and ascertaining this from the centurion, he granted the body to Joseph. So ascertaining that Jesus was dead is the point of that. He granted the body to Joseph. Joseph brought a linen cloth, took it down to him, wrapped him in the linen cloth, and laid him in a tomb which had been hewn out in the rock. And he rolled the stone away against the entrance of the tomb. Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of Joseph. So now there's only two, right? We're looking on to see where he was laid. So Matthew 27:60 says that he laid him in his own new tomb. So Joseph, by saying this, laying him in his own tomb, because this wasn't just his tomb, this was a family tomb. This was an extravagant display of devotion that Joseph is doing here. This is an expensive piece of land that he was offering to Jesus at this time, when everyone else was standing at a distance or had run away entirely. This was hewn out and chiseled out of rock. It was not easy. It was not cheap. So this was big. Not everyone got a tomb like this. This would have been for the rich and for the influential. And so by Joseph giving him access to his family tomb, he's saying, this guy's in my family. That's the ramification. That's the significance of what Jesus is saying here. I am yoking myself. I am partnering up with this guy that the Sanhedrin Council had just shamed. They had shamefully killed, and now he is saying that he is with him. Matthew gives us a little bit more information on this. It says, now on the next day, the day after the preparation, the chief priests and the Pharisees gathered together with Pilate and said, Sir, we remember that when he was still alive, that the deceiver said, after 3 days I am to rise again. Therefore, give orders for the grave to be made secure until the 3rd day. Otherwise, his disciples may come and steal him away to say to the people, he has risen from the dead, and the last deception will be worse than the first. Pilate said to him, you have a guard. Go, make it as secure as you know how. And they went and made the grave secure. And along with the guard, they set a seal on the stone. We're going to talk a little bit and close out with that idea of the seal. But let's talk a little bit about the tomb. I have a couple of images here. First of all, this is a pretty good depiction of what that would have looked like. There would have been some sort of a trough like this. It would have been a circular stone that would have been rolled. Because remember, this is a family tomb. You don't seal it up after one person is buried and leave it. You may have to come back and bury another relative at some point in the future. So it needs to be a big enough obstacle for an animal not to desecrate the body, but also something that you could move the next time a loved one passed away and you needed to put them in there. The other thing, when we look in light of that idea of the seal, and this is where we'll close out today, the seal. This was the best image. It's a little bit fuzzy, but the best image I could find to demonstrate what some of the things that I'd read about this, what it would have looked like. They would have, think about like a seal on a letter, a wax seal that people would do. It would be something similar to that. You see the red marks on this image. They would have put that together and looped it through and put that large version of a letter seal, a large version of the Roman seal on that, signifying that this is sealed by the authority of Rome. Okay, so that's something pretty interesting to note there. And as we think about that seal and the seal that's on Jesus's tomb, and we think about Revelation 20 verse 3 that reads like this. It says, "And he threw him into the abyss," him being the enemy, "and shut it and sealed it over him, so that he would not deceive the nations any longer until the 1,000 years were completed. After these things he must be released for a short time." So the same word sealed used in Matthew is now being used in Revelation. And the thing that's profound to me to think about as we close out today is that God breaks both seals. The seal on Jesus's tomb was broken by God, and that led to victory. The Satan seal is broken and by God, and that's going to lead to his defeat. So what is significant and profound in this use of the word seal is God is sovereign. He is sovereign over death as he breaks the seal over the grave. He's sovereign over sin as he breaks the seal connected with Satan. So he's victorious over sin, and he's victorious over defeat. And so as we close out today, just keep that in mind, that we are servants of the God Most High, and that he has power over death and sin, and he has victory over that. And so live in peace in that, and live lives as you go out today that reflect that you are part of the kingdom of God that has that kind of victory over sin and death. Go out and live faithful lives. Have a good one.